How does a federal hydrologist radio in GPS coordinates for solid ground at a location that's been 6 feet underwater since 1927? On September 12, 2019, Dr. Amanda Thibodaux transmitted her final position from Louisiana's St. Bernard Parish, 29.8156 north, 89.9947 west. She reported standing on the remnants of an old shell road in perfectly calm water, while Hurricane Barry's outer bands whipped the surrounding marsh into 4-foot waves. When Coast Guard crews reached her boat the next morning, they found Amanda's equipment still recording data. Water temperature at 72 degrees, in waters that should have measured 86. Salinity levels indicating fresh water where only salt marsh existed. Current patterns following a river channel that hadn't flowed since the Great Flood reshaped the delta. But it was Amanda's waterproof field notebook that stopped investigators cold. Detailed sketches of a main street lined with shotgun houses, a general store, a Catholic church, the exact layout of Violet, Louisiana, a community that had been destroyed 92 years earlier. Her drawings matched archival photographs down to the hand-painted signs. Dr. Amanda Thibodaux was gone. Her instruments had recorded conditions from 1926. And her Cajun guide, whose family had navigated these waters for 7 generations, had simply gathered his belongings and vanished with her. On the morning of September 12, 2019, Dr. Amanda Thibodaux pulled into the gravel parking lot of the St. Bernard Parish Emergency Operations Center as the first gray bands of cloud cover swept in from the Gulf of Mexico. The National Weather Service had issued a tropical storm watch for southeastern Louisiana, with Hurricane Barry tracking northwest toward the Delta parishes. For most residents, this meant securing boats and checking generators. For Amanda, it meant something far more urgent. At 34, Amanda was one of the youngest senior hydrographers working for the National Ocean Service. Her specialty was rapid response coastal mapping, the kind of precise underwater surveying that helped emergency managers predict exactly where storm surge would go and how high it would climb. She'd been deployed to St. Bernard Parish because something wasn't adding up in the federal flood models. Parish Emergency Coordinator Mike Russell met Amanda at the Operations Center, a concrete block building designed to withstand Category 3 winds. Inside, multiple computer screens displayed real-time data from tide gauges scattered across the wetlands. Russell, a thick-set man with graying hair and the weathered hands of someone who'd grown up on shrimp boats, pointed to a cluster of red indicators on the main display. "Been getting readings that don't make sense," he told Amanda, his voice carrying the distinctive accent of St. Bernard Parish. "Tide stations showing water movement that doesn't match what NOAA's computer models are predicting. We had 3 inches more surge during that tropical depression last month than anything in your system said we should have seen." Amanda studied the data, her trained eye immediately catching the anomalies. The tide gauge at Shell Beach was recording water levels that suggested an entirely different underwater topography than what appeared on official charts. Even more puzzling, the salinity readings indicated freshwater influence in areas that should have been purely saltwater marsh. "When did this start?" she asked, scrolling through historical data on her tablet. "About 6 months ago," Russell replied. "Right around the time we had that sequence of winter storms. Nothing dramatic, just persistent differences between what your models predict and what actually happens when water starts moving." For the next 2 hours, Amanda assembled her equipment in the back of her government-issued pickup truck. Her specialized sonar array could map underwater terrain changes in real time, crucial data for updating flood models during active storm events. She also carried GPS-linked tide sensors that could detect water level changes down to the millimeter, and water quality instruments that measured temperature, salinity, and flow direction. By early afternoon, Amanda had established radio contact with the Emergency Operations Center and was preparing to deploy to her first measurement station. The wind had picked up, carrying the humid, electrically charged air that preceded major weather events. Danish moss hung motionless from the live oaks surrounding the operations center, as if the entire landscape was holding its breath. "Base. This is Survey 1. Amanda's voice crackled over the radio at 2:47 p.m. on TN. I'm setting up the first data collection point at coordinates 29.8547 north, 89.9628 west. Water depth is 12 feet, which matches the charts, but I'm seeing some unusual subsidence patterns on the sonar. Roussel leaned forward at his desk, studying the GPS coordinates Amanda had provided. That position put her in Chandeleur Sound, in relatively open water between the mainland marsh and the barrier islands. It should have been straightforward surveying. Copy that. Survey 1. What kind of patterns are you seeing? Amanda's response would prove to be her first documented observation of something that didn't fit any known coastal geological model. The bottom contours are showing depression formations that look almost like, well, like old river channels. But according to every historical survey I have, there's never been a major river channel in this area. Not in recorded history, anyway. That transmission, logged at 3:12 p.m. on September 12, 2019, would mark the beginning of Dr. Amanda Thibodaux' final and most perplexing scientific investigation. Boudreaux Haber was mending nets behind his fishing camp on Bayou Terre au Boeuf when Mike Roussel called to ask for his help. At 63, Boudreaux represented the 7th generation of his family to work these waters, and there wasn't a channel, sandbar, or oyster reef within 50 miles that he couldn't navigate in the dark. More importantly for the current situation, there wasn't a water movement pattern in St. Bernard Parish that his family hadn't observed and remembered. She needs someone who knows where the water goes when it moves, Russell explained over the phone. Your daddy used to help the Corps of Engineers back in the day, and I figured maybe you could take this federal lady to where she needs to go. Boudreaux agreed, partly out of civic duty and partly out of curiosity about what the government scientists were finally ready to acknowledge about the way water really behaved in Louisiana's wetlands. He'd been hearing stories from other fishermen about strange tidal patterns, about water running the wrong direction during storms, about familiar fishing spots that seemed to be in different places than they used to be. When Dr. Thibodaux arrived at his dock later that afternoon, Boudreaux could immediately tell she was the type of scientist who trusted instruments more than experience. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had advanced degrees and federal credentials, someone accustomed to being the most knowledgeable person in the room. Her equipment filled the back of her truck, waterproof cases containing thousands of dollars worth of electronic surveying gear. Mr. Hebert, she said, extending a hand. I appreciate you taking time to help with this survey work. The parish coordinator says you know these waters better than anyone. Boudreaux shook her hand and nodded toward his 22-foot aluminum boat, designed for navigating the shallow, changing channels of the delta. Been working this water since I was 12, he said. My grandfather, he used to tell stories about water that moves in patterns, water that remembers things. Amanda smiled politely, the way educated people do when locals share folk wisdom. That's interesting. I'm more focused on the scientific data, though. Changes in bottom topography, tidal flow variations, that sort of thing. As they loaded her equipment into the boat, Boudreaux tried a different approach. You know, during Hurricane Gustave, we had surge come from the north instead of the south. Water was running uphill, essentially. My family, we've been keeping track of things like that for a long time. Storm surge can be unpredictable, Amanda replied, checking the GPS coordinates on her tablet. That's why we need accurate real-time measurements. Folk observations are valuable for historical context, but we need precise data for emergency planning. Boudreaux started the outboard motor and guided the boat through the narrow channel behind his camp. The water was the color of café au lait, heavy with sediment stirred up by the approaching storm's outer bands. As they moved deeper into the marsh, he pointed out landmarks. The old oil platform that marked the entrance to Grand Bayou, the stand of dead cypress trees that indicated the salinity boundary, the place where his grandfather used to catch redfish before the water got too salty. See that patch of water over there, he said, pointing to an area that looked identical to the surrounding marsh to Amanda's eyes. That's what my family calls moving water. Looks the same as everything else, but the current runs different there. Changes direction with the moon, but not the way tides should change. Amanda glanced up from her instruments. What do you mean exactly? Hard to explain to someone who hasn't lived with it, Boudreaux said. But during big weather, that water remembers where it used to go. Before the levees, before they changed the river. Water has memory in Louisiana. At 4:23 p.m., Amanda's radio crackled to life. Base. This is Survey 1. I'm at the second measurement point and I'm getting some unusual readings. The GPS shows I'm at coordinates 29.8342 north, 89.9855 west. But my depth sounder is reading 38 feet of water. According to the charts, this should be 16 feet maximum depth. Thibodaux had been watching his own depth finder, an older model that had been reliable for 15 years. It was showing 16 feet, exactly what the charts indicated. He didn't mention this discrepancy to Dr. Thibodaux, who was busily recording data from her more sophisticated instruments. Base. I'm also registering tidal flow reversals that don't correspond to any known current patterns, Amanda continued. The water is moving northeast, against what should be the prevailing flow direction. Salinity is reading 12 parts per thousand, which would indicate significant freshwater input, but there's no freshwater source within 5 miles of this position. Mike Russell's voice came back over the radio. Copy that, Survey 1. Are you having any equipment malfunctions? Negative, Base. All instruments are functioning normally. The readings are just unusual. Thibodaux quietly adjusted their position, reading the water in ways that didn't require electronic instruments. The surface showed patterns he'd learned to recognize as a boy. The subtle differences in color and texture that indicated changing currents. The way debris moved in spirals that revealed underwater obstacles. What he saw matched what his family had always known about this area. But what Dr. Thibodaux's instruments were recording seemed to describe a completely different body of water. One that followed rules he'd never encountered in 51 years of navigating these marshes. As the afternoon wore on, the disconnect between traditional knowledge and scientific measurement would only deepen, setting the stage for mysteries that neither federal technology nor generations of local wisdom could fully explain. The last radio transmission from Dr. Amanda Thibodaux came at 7:47 p.m. on September 12, 2019. By that time, the outer bands of Hurricane Barry were generating steady 25-knot winds across St. Bernard Parish, and the light was beginning to fade across the vast expanse of marshland and open water. Base, this is Survey 1. Amanda's voice came through clearly with no indication of distress. I'm positioned at coordinates 29.8156 north, 89.9947 west, preparing to deploy the final tide sensor array. Thibodaux is anchoring the boat while I take water samples. Mike Russell noted the coordinates in the Emergency Operations Center log. When he plotted them on his digital chart system, he frowned. According to every official survey map, hydrographic chart, and satellite image available to the parish, those coordinates placed Dr. Thibodaux's boat in a location that should have been 6 feet underwater, even at low tide. The area was marked as submerged marsh, part of the vast shallow water system that had been created when the 1927 flood permanently altered the delta's landscape. Survey 1, can you confirm your GPS coordinates? Russell asked. Confirmed, Base. 29.8156 north, 89.9947 west. I'm showing solid ground here. What looks like the remains of an old shell road. My equipment is registering a depth of 18 inches, and we're sitting in perfectly calm water. Actually, it's remarkably calm given the conditions everywhere else. Russell checked the marine weather data. Throughout the rest of St. Bernard Parish, wind speeds were consistent with tropical storm conditions. Wave heights in Chandeleur Sound were running 4 to 6 feet. But Amanda was reporting calm water at coordinates that shouldn't have supported a boat in the first place. Dr. Thibodaux, Russell said, I'm showing some discrepancies between your position and our charts. Are you certain about your location? Base, I've got triple redundancy on GPS. All systems are showing the same coordinates. I'm also seeing some interesting historical features here. What appears to be remnants of wooden pilings, probably from old dock structures. And Thibodaux says this area matches descriptions his grandfather gave of fishing spots from before the big flood. That was Amanda's final transmission. When Russell attempted radio contact 20 minutes later at 8:07 p.m., there was no response. Following emergency protocols, He tried reaching Survey 1 every 10 minminutes for the next hour. By 9:15 p.m., with Hurricane Barry's winds approaching 30 knots, Russell declared Dr. Thibodaux overdue and initiated emergency response procedures. The initial search had to wait until morning due to weather conditions, but at first light on September 13th, a Coast Guard helicopter crew spotted Amanda's survey boat exactly where her final GPS coordinates had indicated. The 22-foot aluminum vessel was properly anchored in 18 inches of clear water, its bow pointing into what little wind remained from the passing storm. From the air, the scene appeared completely normal. The boat floated level and stable, showing no signs of damage or distress. All of Amanda's expensive surveying equipment remained secured in the stern, with several instruments still actively recording data. Her laptop computer was open and running, displaying real-time measurements from the tide sensors she'd deployed. When Coast Guard rescue swimmers reached the boat, they found a scene that defied immediate explanation. Dr. Thibodaux was simply not there. Her personal belongings remained undisturbed. Her water bottle sat half full on the center console. Her field notebook lay open to the page where she'd been recording measurements. Her life jacket hung on the seat back where she'd placed it. The boat's emergency radio worked perfectly. Boudreaux Haber was also missing, but his absence felt different somehow. His fishing gear was gone from its usual storage compartment, and his personal cooler was no longer in the boat. It appeared he had deliberately gathered his belongings, as if preparing to leave. But the boat showed no evidence that anyone had departed by swimming or by another vessel. Most puzzling of all was what Amanda's instruments had recorded during the final hours of September 12th. The data logs showed continuous measurements right up until 11:43 p.m., nearly 4 hours after her last radio transmission. During that period, her equipment had documented water temperature, salinity levels, and tidal flow patterns that seemed to describe an entirely different aquatic environment. The temperature reading showed a steady 72 degrees Fahrenheit, which was 15 degrees cooler than the ambient water temperature measured at nearby monitoring stations. Salinity levels had dropped to 2.4 parts per thousand, indicating nearly fresh water in an area that should have measured 25-30 parts per thousand. Most significantly, her current meters had recorded consistent water flow toward the northwest, following what appeared to be a defined channel. When investigators overlaid Amanda's final data recordings onto historical maps, they discovered something remarkable. Her instruments had measured water patterns that precisely matched the flow of Bayou Terre Bavos as it existed before the Great Flood of 1927. The temperature, salinity, and current direction all corresponded to a freshwater bayou system that had been permanently altered nearly a century earlier. According to her equipment's timestamp records, Dr. Amanda Thibodaux had stepped off that boat at 7:52 p.m. on September 12, 2019, into water that behaved according to the laws of hydrology that had governed St. Bernard Parish in 1926. Where she had gone from there, no scientific instrument could measure. The mystery had only just begun. By 9:00 a.m. on September 13, 2019, the multi-agency search operation for Dr. Amanda Thibodaux had expanded to cover 50 square miles of St. Bernard Parish wetlands. Coast Guard Sector New Orleans coordinated the effort, deploying 2 helicopters, 3 rescue boats, and a dive team from the Marine Safety Detachment. The Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries contributed airboat crews familiar with navigating the maze of shallow channels and marsh islands that defined the search area. Search and Rescue Coordinator Lieutenant Commander Sarah Broussard established the command post at the Violet Canal Marina, the closest solid ground to Amanda's last known position. The morning was clear and calm following Hurricane Barry's passage, with visibility extending for miles across the flat expanse of marsh grass and open water. Conditions were ideal for aerial searching. "We're dealing with an area that's 90% shallow water and wetlands," Broussard explained to assembled search teams during the 10:00 a.m. briefing. "Maximum depth in most areas is 6 to 8 feet, with excellent water clarity. If Dr. Thibodaux is in the water, we should be able to see her from the air or locate her with sonar." The initial aerial reconnaissance revealed no trace of Amanda or Boudreaux Haber. Helicopter crews systematically covered every channel, pond, and marsh island within a 5-mile radius of the GPS coordinates from Amanda's final transmission. They photographed anything that appeared unusual. Debris that might have come from personal belongings, areas where vegetation had been disturbed, any signs of human activity. Meanwhile, dive teams focused their efforts on the immediate vicinity of where Amanda's boat had been found. The water was remarkably clear for Louisiana coastal waters, with visibility extending to the bottom in most areas. Divers reported finding several interesting features that didn't appear on any official charts. What appeared to be the remains of old road pilings, sections of shell and gravel that formed linear patterns suggesting former roadways, and areas where the marsh grass grew in geometric shapes that hinted at long-vanished human development. "It's like someone laid out a community down there decades ago," reported dive team leader Petty Officer First Class Marcus Tran. "There are clear signs of human activity, but everything's been underwater for a long time, certainly longer than any recent development in this area." The dive teams found no trace of Dr. Thibodaux or her missing guide. More puzzling, they found no evidence that anyone had recently entered the water from the survey boat. The sediment patterns on the marsh bottom showed no disturbance, no footprints, no indication that anyone had walked through the shallow areas surrounding the boat's anchorage. While the official search continued, investigators began examining Amanda's field equipment and data logs for clues about her disappearance. What they discovered only deepened the mystery. Her instruments had continued recording environmental data for nearly 4 hours after her final radio transmission, documenting conditions that contradicted everything the search teams were observing. According to Amanda's data logs, the water temperature in her immediate area had remained at 72 degrees throughout the evening of September 12th. However, temperature readings from nearby Coast Guard monitoring stations showed typical September water temperatures of 86-87 degrees. Amanda's salinity meters had recorded freshwater conditions, while samples collected by the dive teams the following morning showed normal saltwater marsh salinity levels. Most significantly, Amanda's current measurement devices had documented consistent northwest water flow throughout the night, following what appeared to be a well-defined channel. But when marine surveyors attempted to locate this channel using standard sonar equipment, they found only the typical shallow, muddy bottom of St. Bernard Parish marsh. Her instruments were recording data from a different body of water, admitted Dr. James Picu, Amanda's supervisor from the National Ocean Service. Either there was a massive equipment malfunction affecting multiple independent systems simultaneously, which is virtually impossible, or Dr. Thibodaux was measuring environmental conditions that we can't replicate or verify. On the afternoon of September 14th, Boudreaux Hébert's cousin, Louis Hébert, approached search coordinators with information that added another layer to the mystery. Louis, who had worked as a fishing guide in the area for over 30 years, reported that several members of his extended family had observed unusual water behavior in the weeks leading up to Amanda's disappearance. "My nephew was running crab traps in that area about 2 weeks ago," Louis told investigators. He said he found traps that had been moved to places where the water was too shallow for boats to reach, but the traps weren't damaged and they were full of crabs, like something had carried them through water that wasn't there anymore. Louis also shared family oral histories about the area where Amanda had vanished. According to stories passed down through generations of Hebert fishermen, that section of marsh had been the site of a small Creole farming community before the 1927 flood. The community, known locally as Petit Bois, had been completely submerged when levee breaks permanently altered the hydrology of the region. "My grandpère, he used to say that during big storms you could sometimes see the old roads under the water," Louis explained. He claimed that certain tides would bring back the channels the way they used to run before the flood changed everything. "We always thought it was just old man stories, but maybe there was something to it." As the search entered its third day with no trace of Dr. Amanda Thibodaux, investigators faced an unprecedented situation. A missing person case where the physical evidence suggested the victim had disappeared into environmental conditions that no longer existed, guided by someone who seemed to understand water patterns that defied modern hydrological science. The mystery was about to deepen even further. 3 days into the search for Dr. Amanda Thibodaux, St. Bernard Parish historian. Marie Boudouin made a discovery that would transform the investigation from a missing person case into something far more mysterious. Working late in the parish archives on September 18th, Boudouin had been cross-referencing Amanda's final GPS coordinates with historical flood maps at the request of the Coast Guard. What she found stopped her cold. The coordinates matched exactly, down to the second, with the location of Violet, Louisiana, a thriving farming community that had been completely destroyed in the Great Flood of 1927. I ran the numbers 3 times, Boudouin later told investigators. Amanda's equipment placed her standing in what used to be the town square of Violet. The problem is, that square has been under 8 feet of salt water for the past 97 years. Viola Tran, a 78-year-old Creole elder from Poydras, had been following news of the disappearance with particular interest. Her great-grandmother had lived in Violet before the flood. When Tran learned of the coordinate match, she requested a meeting with Parish Emergency Management. My mère used to tell stories, Tran explained to investigators on September 19th, about the families who went with the water when the levees broke. She said some folks just walked out into the flood and disappeared. Not drowned, disappeared. Like they followed the water somewhere else. The oral histories that Tran and other elderly community members shared painted a picture of the 1927 flood that differed significantly from official records. According to these accounts, several families in low-lying communities had simply vanished during the flooding, not swept away by currents, but gone as if they had never existed. The water came up slow at first. Tran recounted her great-grandmother's words. But in some places, it came up from underneath, like it was remembering where it used to run. People said you could see old things in that water. Houses, roads, even people from before. Meanwhile, the analysis of Amanda's field equipment revealed data that defied explanation. Her conductivity sensors had recorded water salinity levels of less than 500 parts per million, indicating fresh water in an area where saltwater marsh typically measured 15,000 to 35,000 parts per million. Her temperature probes showed consistent readings of 72 degrees Fahrenheit, matching historical records for Mississippi River water temperature in late September, not the 85-degree brackish water typical of the current wetlands. Most puzzling of all were the detailed sketches found in Amanda's waterproof field notebook. Federal investigators had initially dismissed them as preliminary drawings for her survey report. But when shown to Marie Boudouin, the historian immediately recognized what Amanda had drawn, the layout of Violet, Louisiana, as it existed in 1926. The sketches showed a main street lined with shotgun houses, a general store with a covered porch, a small Catholic church with a pointed steeple, and elevated wooden sidewalks typical of flood-prone areas. According to Boudouin's research, Amanda's drawings matched photographs from the Louisiana State Museum's collection with remarkable accuracy, down to the specific architectural details of buildings that had been underwater since the Coolidge administration. She drew the Comeau family store exactly as it looked, Boudouin noted, including the hand-painted signs and the way the porch sagged on the left side. There's no way she could have known those details from any existing records. Dr. James Melancon, a hydrologist with the U.S. Geological Survey's Louisiana Water Science Center, was brought in to review Amanda's data on September 20th. His analysis raised more questions than it answered. The flow patterns she recorded follow the pre-1927 channel of Bayou Terre aux Boeufs, Melancon explained to the investigation team. Before the flood control projects, that bayou carried Mississippi River water through what's now salt marsh. Her instruments were reading current and sediment data consistent with river flow, not tidal marsh conditions. According to Melancon, Amanda's measurements indicated she was standing in water that behaved like a freshwater bayou circa 1925, complete with the specific mineral content and flow characteristics that would have existed before the levee system altered the entire delta ecosystem. As news of these findings spread quietly through St. Bernard Parish, more residents came forward with similar accounts. Commercial fisherman Paul Rodrigue reported seeing old buildings beneath the water during severe storms. Shrimp boat captain Lisa Boudreau described occasionally finding household items in her nets. Dishes, furniture legs, children's toys. That appeared far too old to be recent hurricane debris. My daddy always said the marsh remembers, Rodrigue told investigators. When the water gets angry, it shows you what used to be there. The investigation team now faced questions that challenged their fundamental understanding of the case. Had Amanda Thibodaux somehow encountered St. Bernard Parish as it existed nearly a century ago? Her scientific instruments suggested she had measured environmental conditions that precisely matched the pre-flood ecosystem. Her field notes contained architectural details that no contemporary source could have provided. Her GPS coordinates placed her in a community that had been underwater for nearly a century. Yet, traditional scientific explanation offered no framework for understanding how a federal hydrologist could disappear into the past while her equipment continued recording data in the present. The mystery had evolved beyond a simple missing person case into something that challenged the very nature of time, place, and memory in Louisiana's ever-changing delta landscape. As investigators prepared to expand their inquiry, one question remained central to the case. If the Mississippi Delta could somehow retain the memory of its past configurations, what other secrets might be hidden beneath the waters of St. Bernard Parish? As the investigation into Amanda Thibodaux's disappearance entered its second week, reports began surfacing from across Louisiana's coastal region that suggested the St. Bernard Parish incident was not an isolated event. Dr. Robert Chauvin, a marine geologist with Louisiana State University, contacted investigators on September 24th with troubling information. Over the past 18 months, his research team had documented similar anomalous readings from tide monitoring stations along a 200-mile stretch of the Gulf Coast. "We've been tracking what we initially classified as equipment malfunctions," Chauvin explained during a conference call with federal investigators. Conductivity sensors reading fresh water in salt marshes, temperature gauges showing readings inconsistent with seasonal patterns, flow meters detecting current patterns that don't match known tidal cycles. The pattern Chauvin's team had identified was disturbing. The anomalous readings occurred primarily during tropical weather systems, and they consistently indicated water conditions that matched historical river flow patterns from before the extensive levee and flood control modifications of the 1930s. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration meteorologist Sandra Pham provided additional evidence. NOAA tide stations from Sabine Pass, Texas to Mobile Bay, Alabama had recorded unexplained water movement during the exact time frame of Amanda's disappearance on September 12th. Between 7:15 and 8:45 p.m. Central Time, we registered synchronized tidal variations across multiple stations, Pham reported. The pattern doesn't correspond to any known oceanographic phenomenon. It's as if something caused the entire northern Gulf of Mexico to briefly follow a different tidal regime. The time frame precisely matched Amanda's final radio transmission, and the period when her GPS coordinates had placed her in the submerged location of historical Violet, Louisiana. Boudreaux-Hébert's family finally broke their silence about their traditional knowledge. In a private meeting with Parish investigators on September 26th, Louis Hebert revealed that Cajun and Creole families throughout the Delta had been quietly documenting what they called temps d'eau, time water events, for generations. "My great-great-grandfather kept a journal," Louis explained, producing a leather-bound notebook filled with handwritten French and English entries dating back to 1892. "Every few years during big storms, the water remembers where it used to go. People see things, old things. Sometimes people disappear into that remembering." The journal entries, later translated by Louisiana State University's French Louisiana Studies program, describe dozens of incidents over more than a century. Fishermen encountering pre-Civil War plantation buildings during Hurricane Thibodaux. Shrimp boats find themselves in what appeared to be 19th century river channels. Entire families reportedly walking into floodwaters and vanishing, only to be found days later with no memory of their disappearance but carrying objects that shouldn't have existed. One entry from 1915 described an event remarkably similar to Amanda's case. Uncle Alcide went to measure the water rise during the big wind. Came back 3 days later, saying he saw grandpa's old house, the one that got took by the river in 1867. Had grandpa's china cup in his pocket, still warm with coffee. The Hebert family had developed their own protocols for dealing with these events. Children were taught to recognize the signs: water that flowed upstream, fog that smelled like magnolia blossoms, the sound of church bells from communities that no longer existed. "We don't fight the time water," explained Boudreaux's aunt, 82-year-old Clotilde Hebert. "We respect it. Sometimes it takes people where they need to go. Sometimes it brings them back. But it always has its reasons." Dr. Elena Vasquez, Amanda's supervisor at the National Weather Service, made her own revelation during a closed-door meeting with federal investigators on September 28. The Coastal Marine Automated Network had been experiencing what administrators had classified as chronic data anomalies for over a decade. "We've had instruments recording impossible readings throughout Louisiana's Delta region," Vasquez admitted. "Water level measurements indicating the presence of land masses that were destroyed a century ago. Salinity readings suggesting massive freshwater intrusion where no freshwater sources exist. We've been quietly replacing equipment and recalibrating instruments, but the anomalies persist." According to Vasquez, federal policy had been to classify these incidents under maritime security protocols to prevent public speculation about equipment reliability. However, Amanda's disappearance had forced a reconsideration of that approach. "Amanda wasn't just our best hydrographer," Vasquez said. "She was the most skeptical scientist I've ever worked with. If Amanda's instruments recorded data indicating she was standing in a 1920s bayou, then something extraordinary happened out there." Meanwhile, other federal surveyors began reporting their own experiences. A Corps of Engineers team working near Lafayette, Louisiana, described finding survey markers dated 1923 that appeared to be freshly placed. A USGS crew conducting seismic studies in Barataria Bay reported their equipment detecting underground structures consistent with pre-flood development patterns. As September gave way to October, the official search for Amanda Thibodaux continued, but investigators increasingly found themselves grappling with questions that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of time, memory, and then the relationship between human communities and the waterways that sustain them. The Mississippi Delta, it seems, might be more than a dynamic ecosystem shaped by sediment and tide. According to growing evidence, it might be a living archive of its own history, one that occasionally allowed the present to intersect with the past in ways that science had yet to understand. The question remained: if the Delta retained memory of its historical configurations, what did that mean for the hundreds of thousands of people who lived and worked in its ever-changing landscape? And where in that vast archive of water and time was Dr. Amanda Thibodaux? 6 months after Dr. Amanda Thibodaux's disappearance, the federal response to the St. Bernard Parish incident has fundamentally altered how coastal Louisiana approaches flood management and scientific research. The National Weather Service, in coordination with the Army Corps of Engineers, has implemented what officials carefully term enhanced data collection protocols for Louisiana's coastal regions. The new procedures require federal hydrographers to work in pairs and maintain continuous radio contact during storm conditions. More significantly, they now incorporate what internal documents refer to as traditional ecological knowledge into official survey operations. Boudreaux Hebert has become an unlikely federal contractor, serving as cultural liaison for scientific expeditions throughout the Mississippi Delta. His role involves briefing research teams about local conditions that don't appear in official databases, including his family's generations of observations about water behavior during severe weather events. "They've finally started listening," Hebert explains from his elevated camp house near Delacroix. "My grandpa's grandpa knew things about these waters that their satellites still can't see. Now they want to learn." The collaboration has produced tangible results. During Hurricane Ida in August 2021, St. Bernard Parish's emergency management successfully predicted flooding patterns that federal models had missed, potentially saving dozens of lives. The prediction accuracy came from overlaying current meteorological data with historical flow patterns documented in Cajun oral traditions. Parish President Guy McInnes acknowledges the unconventional approach. "We're using flood models that incorporate data from the 1800s alongside current satellite imagery. It shouldn't work, but it does. Our evacuation routes now account for areas where our grandparents said the water remembers how to flow. Amanda's research data, meanwhile, remains classified under federal maritime security regulations. However, sources familiar with the ongoing analysis indicate that her final measurements have been used to develop new theoretical frameworks for understanding coastal hydrology in regions with extensive human modification. Dr. James Melancon, the USG's hydrologist who analyzed Amanda's equipment, now leads a quietly funded research project examining what scientists carefully term temporal hydrological variations in coastal Louisiana. While specifics remain restricted, the project reportedly involves monitoring water chemistry and flow patterns during severe weather events, with particular attention to areas where historical communities were relocated or destroyed. We're learning that coastal ecosystems may retain characteristics from previous configurations longer than we assumed, Melancon explains diplomatically. Understanding these legacy patterns could improve our predictive models significantly. The broader implications of Amanda's disappearance have reached academic circles far from Louisiana. The University of Louisiana's Maritime History Department has received federal funding to create a comprehensive database of pre-1930 community locations, building layouts, and infrastructure patterns throughout the Mississippi Delta. The stated goal involves improving archaeological site protection, but researchers acknowledge the database's potential applications for understanding anomalous hydrological data. Clothilde Habert, the elderly Creole storyteller whose family traditions helped interpret Amanda's field notes, has become an unofficial consultant for the project. Her kitchen table now regularly hosts meetings between federal scientists and local elders, sessions where oral histories are carefully documented and cross-referenced with historical records. The young scientists, they write everything down now, she observes with satisfaction. They're learning that just because something can't be measured doesn't mean it isn't real. The search for Amanda Thibodaux officially concluded in March 2020, but surveillance of the area continues under different auspices. Coast Guard patrols maintain a discreet but regular presence near the coordinates where Amanda vanished, and NOAA monitoring stations in the region now collect data at intervals previously considered unnecessary. Local fishing guides report occasional Coast Guard inquiries about unusual water conditions or unexpected equipment readings, though such conversations are rarely documented in official reports. The understanding among St. Bernard Parish residents is clear. Federal authorities remain intensely interested in the area where Amanda disappeared, but that interest is not something to be discussed publicly. Perhaps most significantly, the incident has influenced federal policy regarding indigenous and traditional knowledge and environmental management. The Department of Commerce now requires coastal research projects in Louisiana to include consultation with local communities possessing multi-generational ecological expertise. The policy, implemented quietly in late 2020, represents a dramatic shift from the scientific orthodoxy that Amanda herself had exemplified. Boudreaux Hebert continues his work as a fishing guide, but his role has expanded beyond simple navigation. Federal research teams regularly request his services, not just for his knowledge of safe passage through the marshes, but for his family's accumulated understanding of water behavior that challenges conventional scientific assumptions. Amanda? She was a good scientist, Hebert reflects during a recent trip through the waters where she vanished. But she thought science was just about measuring what you could see. Out here, you got to measure what you can feel, what your grandfather felt, what the water remembers from before your grandfather was born. The precise location where Amanda's boat was found remains unmarked by any official memorial, but local fishermen have noted subtle changes in the area. Water clarity varies unpredictably. Fish behavior differs from surrounding areas. Most notably, several guides report occasional equipment malfunctions near those coordinates. GPS readings that briefly show land masses where open water should be. Depth sounders detecting structures that shouldn't exist. These reports are not included in official databases, but they are carefully noted in the informal networks of knowledge that Boudreaux Hebert's family has maintained for 7 generations. Dr. Amanda Thibodaux remains missing. Her disappearance has changed how federal agencies approach coastal science in Louisiana, but it has not answered the fundamental question of what happened to her on that September afternoon in 2019. The Mississippi Delta continues its ancient work of building and destroying land, carrying sediment and memory in equal measure toward the Gulf of Mexico. And somewhere in those waters, the intersection of past and present continues to challenge human understanding of time, place, and the stories that landscapes remember long after the people who live them are gone. The survey continues, but the questions it raises may be deeper than any instrument can measure. If this case stays with you, you're not alone. Here at Unresolved America, we cover cases like this every single day. Stories that deserve to be remembered, questions that refuse to fade. If you want to keep these investigations alive, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. Drop a like if this story moved you, and leave a comment telling us which detail haunts you most. Until tomorrow, stay curious, stay vigilant, and never stop asking questions.